In the sweltering heat of a Charleston summer in 1905, Ellsworth Raymond Johnson entered the world, his arrival marked by a distinctive bump on his forehead that would earn him the moniker Bumpy, a name that would one day strike fear and admiration in the hearts of Harlem's underworld. Born into a world of racial segregation and limited opportunities, young Bumpy quickly learned that survival meant carving his own path. The streets of Charleston, with their strict racial codes and simmering tensions, became his first classroom in the harsh realities of life for a young African American in the early 20th century. But fate had grander designs for Bumpy Johnson. At the tender age of 14, fleeing the specter of racial violence that threatened his family, he found himself thrust into the pulsing heart of Harlem. The year was 1919, and New York City's famous neighborhood was on the cusp of its renaissance, a bubbling cauldron of culture, ambition, and opportunity, both legal and illicit. As Bumpy stepped off the train at 135th Street, the cacophony of voices, the rhythmic beats of jazz, and the intoxicating smell of possibility filled his senses. Little did he know that the bustling streets of Harlem would become his kingdom, and he, its most unlikely ruler. This is the story of Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, the man who would rise from the depths of poverty to become the undisputed king of Harlem's underworld, challenging the Italian Mafia, outsmarting law enforcement, and leaving an indelible mark on the landscape of organized crime in America. Chapter 1. The Charleston Kid, Bumpy's Early Years. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson entered the world on October 31st, 1905, in Charleston, South Carolina, the youngest of 5 children born to Ellsworth and Genevieve Johnson. The Johnson family lived in a modest 2-story brick house on the city's east side, a predominantly African-American neighborhood that had seen its share of hardship and struggle. From an early age, young Ellsworth, affectionately known as Bumpy for the distinct bump on his forehead, bore witness to the harsh realities of life in the segregated South. His father, a hard-working laborer, often struggled to make ends meet, while his mother supplemented the family's income by taking in laundry and sewing. Despite their financial difficulties, the Johnsons instilled in their children the values of faith, perseverance, and a deep pride in their African-American heritage. As Bumpy grew older, the racial tensions that permeated Charleston became increasingly palpable. He watched helplessly as his father was turned away from job opportunities, denied service at local establishments, and subjected to the humiliating indignities of Jim Crow laws. The young boy's eyes were opened to the systemic oppression that shaped the lives of African Americans in the South, sowing the seeds of resentment and a burning desire to forge his own path. Growing up in Charleston, you couldn't help but see the way the white folks treated us, Bumpy would later recount in an interview. They had all the power, all the money, and they weren't afraid to use it to keep us down. That's when I knew I had to get out of there, find a way to make my own way in the world. Sensing the limited opportunities available to their son in Charleston, Bumpy's parents made the difficult decision to send him north to Harlem, New York, in the summer of 1919. At the age of 14, the young man bid farewell to his family and embarked on a journey that would forever alter the course of his life. The bustling streets of Harlem were a far cry from the familiar confines of Charleston. Bumpy was immediately struck by the energy and diversity of the neighborhood, a vibrant hub for African-American culture, commerce, and political activism. The sights, sounds, and smells of this new urban landscape overwhelmed his senses. But the young man was determined to make his mark. Staying with his aunt and uncle in a cramped tenement apartment, Bumpy quickly learned to navigate the challenges of city life. He observed the workings of the local numbers racket, a thriving underground lottery system that provided employment and income to many Harlem residents. Intrigued by the complex web of connections and the potential for profit, Bumpy began to explore the opportunities that existed in the neighborhood's illicit underworld. Harlem was like a whole new world to me, Bumpy recalled years later. The energy, the hustle, the way people were always trying to get ahead, it was like nothing I'd ever seen before. I knew right then and there that this was where I was going to make my name. Determined to carve out his place in Harlem's landscape, the young Bumpy Johnson began to hone his skills as a hustler, using his quick wit and nimble reflexes to survive on the streets. He ran errands for local bookies, delivered messages, and even served as a lookout for illicit gambling operations. With each passing day, Bumpy's reputation grew, and he gained the respect of those who recognized his potential. It was during this formative period that Bumpy first encountered Stephanie St. Clair, a formidable figure known as the Queen of Numbers in Harlem. St. Clair, a Harlem native and former numbers operator, had risen to prominence through her shrewd business acumen and unwavering determination. Recognizing the young Bumpy's intelligence and street savvy, she took him under her wing, providing him with the guidance and connections he needed to navigate the complex world of organized crime. Stephanie, she was like nothing I'd ever seen before, Bumpy would later reflect. This woman, she was tough as nails, but she also had a heart of gold. She saw something in me, and she took me in, showed me the ropes. I owe her everything. Under St. Clair's tutelage, Bumpy learned the intricacies of the numbers racket, mastering the art of bookkeeping, distribution, and protection. He quickly proved himself to be a valuable asset, demonstrating a keen intellect, a head for strategy, and an unwavering loyalty to his mentor. As Bumpy's skills grew, so too did his influence within Harlem's criminal underworld, setting the stage for his eventual rise to power. The early years of Bumpy Johnson's life in Harlem were marked by a relentless determination to overcome the obstacles that had defined his childhood in the segregated South. Driven by a desire for self-determination and a hunger for power, the young man navigated the treacherous landscape of Harlem's underworld, forging alliances and honing his skills as a savvy operator. With the guidance of Stephanie St. Clair, Bumpy began to carve out his own path, setting the stage for his eventual emergence as one of the most influential and controversial figures in Harlem's history. Chapter 2: Harlem Nights, the education of a hustler. Stepping off the train at 135th Street station, Bumpy Johnson felt a palpable shift in the air. Gone were the stifling confines of Charleston, replaced by the pulsing energy and endless possibilities of Harlem. At just 14 years old, he had traded the familiar comforts of home for the gritty urban landscape of New York City, a decision that would forever shape the trajectory of his life. As he navigated the crowded streets, Bumpy's eyes drank in the sights and sounds that assaulted his senses. Vibrant storefronts, the rhythmic beats of jazz music, and the cacophony of voices all combined to create a sensory experience unlike anything he had encountered before. The sheer scale and diversity of Harlem were both exhilarating and overwhelming, foreshadowing the challenges that lay ahead. Clutching the few belongings he had brought with him, Bumpy made his way through the bustling neighborhood, searching for a familiar face or a friendly guide. His initial attempts to blend in were hampered by his slight stature and youthful appearance, making him an easy target for the seasoned hustlers and petty criminals who roamed the streets. It was during these early days that Bumpy learned the harsh realities of survival in Harlem's underworld. Confronted with the temptations of easy money and the allure of the criminal lifestyle, he quickly adapted, using his quick wit and natural intelligence to navigate the treacherous environment. Petty theft, numbers running, and other small-time hustles became his means of subsistence as he gradually built a reputation for his cunning and resourcefulness. One fateful day, while working a numbers game on a street corner, Bumpy caught the attention of Stephanie St. Clair, a formidable figure in Harlem's criminal landscape. Known as the Queen of Numbers, St. Clair had built an empire on the illegal lottery business, commanding respect and fear from her rivals and the community alike. Intrigued by the young man's poise and determination, St. Clair approached Bumpy, her piercing gaze sizing him up. "You got a name, boy?" she asked, her voice a mix of gravel and silk. Bumpy straightened his shoulders, meeting her steely eyes. "Ellsworth Johnson, ma'am, but they call me Bumpy." St. Clair's lips curled into a wry smile. "Bumpy, huh? Well, you don't look like much, but there's something about you that I like." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the bustling street. "You got a place to stay, Bumpy?" Bumpy shook his head, his heart pounding in his chest. "No, ma'am. Just got off the train from Charleston." I see." St. Clair studied him for a moment, then gestured with a tilt of her head. "Come with me, then. Let's see if we can't find you a place to lay your head." Bumpy followed the imposing woman, his mind racing with a mixture of trepidation and excitement. He knew little about St. Clair beyond her fearsome reputation, but the opportunity to align himself with such a powerful figure was too tempting to pass up. As they navigated the winding streets of Harlem, Bumpy observed the way St. Clair commanded respect and deference from those they encountered. Her mere presence seemed to part the crowds, and Bumpy couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at the sheer force of her personality. Eventually, they arrived at a nondescript brownstone, its exterior belying the hive of activity within. St. Clair led Bumpy through the door and up a narrow staircase, finally ushering him into a sparsely furnished but comfortable room. "This'll be your place for now," she said, settling into a worn armchair. "You'll be working for me, Bumpy, earning your keep. You understand?" Bumpy nodded, his mind racing with the implications of her words. "Yes, ma'am. What exactly will I be doing?" St. Clair leaned back, a contemplative expression on her face. "You've got a good head on your shoulders, I can tell, and you're not afraid to get your hands dirty either." She paused, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. "How would you like to learn the numbers game?" Bumpy's eyes widened, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. The numbers racket was the lifeblood of Harlem's criminal underworld, a complex and lucrative enterprise that required cunning, discipline, and a willingness to operate outside the law. "The numbers game, ma'am?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's right, boy," St. Clair replied, her tone brooking no argument. "You're a quick learner, and I can use someone like you. But make no mistake, this ain't no child's play. You mess up, and it could cost you your life." Bumpy swallowed hard, the gravity of the situation sinking in. Yet, the prospect of learning from the legendary Queen of Numbers was too tempting to resist. He straightened his shoulders, meeting St. Clair's gaze with a newfound determination. "I'm ready, Mum," he said, his voice firm. "Teach me." And so began Bumpy Johnson's education in the ways of Harlem's criminal underworld under the tutelage of the formidable Stephanie St. Clair. As he delved deeper into the intricate world of the numbers racket, Bumpy quickly proved himself a quick learner and a valuable asset to St. Clair's operation. His natural intelligence, combined with a willingness to take calculated risks, soon earned him a respected place within her organization. The coming years would see Bumpy's rise through the ranks as he honed his skills and built a network of allies and informants. His reputation as a shrewd and ruthless operator would eventually make him a force to be reckoned with in Harlem's criminal landscape, setting the stage for the conflicts and alliances that would define his legendary career. Chapter 3: The Queen's Protégé, Rising Through the Ranks. Bumpy Johnson's arrival in Harlem at the age of 14 was nothing short of a baptism by fire. The bustling neighborhood, teeming with opportunity and peril in equal measure, quickly became his proving ground. It was here that he would hone the sharp instincts and street smarts that would one day make him a formidable force in the city's underworld. In the early years, Bumpy struggled to find his footing, taking on odd jobs and petty hustles to make ends meet. But his keen intellect and unwavering determination soon caught the attention of Stephanie St. Clair, the legendary Queen of Numbers who controlled Harlem's lucrative illegal lottery racket. St. Clair, a no-nonsense businesswoman with a reputation for ruthlessness, recognized the young Bumpy's potential. "That boy's got more brains than the whole lot of them put together," she would later recount. "He just needed the right guidance to channel that energy in the right direction." Under St. Clair's tutelage, Bumpy embarked on a crash course in the intricacies of the numbers game. He quickly mastered the complex web of bookkeepers, runners, and collectors that kept the illicit enterprise humming. More importantly, he learned the art of navigating the treacherous waters of Harlem's criminal landscape, forging alliances and neutralizing potential threats. Bumpy was a sponge, recalled one of St. Clair's lieutenants. "He'd sit in on our meetings, listen intently, and then come back the next day with a dozen ideas on how to streamline our operations or expand our reach." The man had a mind for this kind of thing, no doubt about it. As Bumpy's skills grew, so did his reputation within Harlem's underworld. He proved himself adept at collecting debts, resolving disputes, and keeping the lucrative numbers racket running smoothly. St. Clair, impressed by his loyalty and resourcefulness, began to rely on him more and more. "Stephanie trusted that boy with her life," said a former associate. When the heat was on, she'd send Bumpy to handle the tough stuff. He'd get the job done, no questions asked, and he'd do it without leaving a trace. Bumpy's rise through the ranks was not without its challenges, however. The numbers game was a cutthroat business, and he quickly learned that betrayal and violence were ever-present threats. On more than one occasion, he found himself in the crosshairs of rival gangs or disgruntled employees seeking to usurp his position. But Bumpy's cool demeanor and strategic mind allowed him to navigate these treacherous waters with remarkable poise. He forged alliances, made calculated concessions, and when necessary, struck back with ruthless efficiency. His reputation for toughness and resourcefulness only grew, cementing his status as a rising star in Harlem's criminal hierarchy. As the 1930s dawned, Bumpy had become an indispensable part of St. Clair's operation. He oversaw the day-to-day management of the numbers racket, handled sensitive negotiations, and even acted as a trusted enforcer when the situation called for it. With his mentor's backing, Bumpy's influence in Harlem continued to expand, solidifying his position as a key player in the neighborhood's shadowy underworld. Bumpy was the brains, and Stephanie was the brawn, explained one former associate. Together, they were an unstoppable force. The Queen had the connections and the clout, but Bumpy knew how to make things happen on the ground. That's what made their partnership so damn effective. Yet, even as Bumpy's power grew, he never forgot his humble beginnings or the community that had shaped him. He took pride in his ability to provide for his family and friends, using his earnings to support those in need and cultivate a network of loyal followers. This delicate balance between criminal enterprise and community support would become a defining aspect of Bumpy's legacy in the years to come. As the 1930s drew to a close, Bumpy Johnson stood poised to take on the next chapter of his remarkable journey. With the guidance and backing of Stephanie St. Clair, he had risen through the ranks of Harlem's underworld, honing his skills and building a formidable reputation. But the true test of his mettle was yet to come, as a new threat emerged from the Bronx, setting the stage for an epic clash that would cement Bumpy's status as a Harlem legend. Chapter 4. War in the Streets, Bumpy versus Dutch Schultz. The streets of Harlem were a battleground, a constant clash of ambition and power. Bumpy Johnson, once a young protege of the Queen of Numbers, Stephanie St. Clair, had grown into a formidable force in his own right. But now, a new challenger had arrived, hungry to seize control of Harlem's lucrative numbers racket, Dutch Schultz. Schultz, a ruthless mobster from the Bronx, had set his sights on expanding his criminal empire. Harlem's thriving underground economy was a tempting prize, and he was determined to claim it as his own. Bumpy, fiercely loyal to St. Clair and the Harlem community, knew he had to act fast to protect their interests. The first shots were fired on a warm summer night in 1931. Bumpy's men, acting on his orders, ambushed a group of Schultz's henchmen who were trying to muscle their way into a Harlem numbers joint. The ensuing firefight left several casualties on both sides, signaling the start of a brutal turf war. Bumpy wasn't going to let no outsider come in and take what was ours, recalled Hubert Delaney, a longtime Harlem resident. He knew he had to stand up to Schultz, no matter the cost. As the conflict escalated, Bumpy's strategic brilliance became increasingly apparent. He leveraged his network of informants and allies, coordinating a series of targeted strikes against Schultz's operations. Safecrackers were hired to hit Schultz's collection points, while snipers picked off his enforcers one by one. Schultz, unaccustomed to such fierce resistance, grew increasingly frustrated. He responded with even greater violence, ordering his men to burn down numbers houses and terrorize Harlem's residents. But Bumpy refused to back down, meeting Schultz's aggression with his own brand of ruthless determination. Bumpy was a master of the game, said Stephanie St. Clair, reflecting on the war. He knew how to play the angles, how to outmaneuver his opponents. Dutch Schultz thought he could just roll in and take over, but he didn't know who he was dealing with. The conflict reached a crescendo in the summer of 1932 when Schultz's men attempted to assassinate Bumpy in broad daylight. As Bumpy walked down 135th Street, a hail of bullets shattered the calm, narrowly missing their target. Bumpy, unharmed, immediately went into hiding, emerging only to orchestrate a devastating counterattack. That was the moment Bumpy realized he had to go all in, said Delaney. He couldn't just play defense anymore, he had to strike back and show Schultz who was boss in Harlem. Bumpy's retaliation was swift and ruthless. He assembled a team of skilled marksmen and sent them after Schultz's top lieutenants, systematically eliminating the key figures in his organization. The message was clear. Harlem belonged to Bumpy Johnson and Stephanie St. Clair, and they would not surrender it without a fight. Schultz, his ranks decimated and his grip on Harlem slipping, was forced to reconsider his strategy. He reached out to Bumpy, proposing a truce and a division of the territory. Bumpy, sensing an opportunity to consolidate his power, agreed to the deal. Bumpy knew he couldn't win this war forever, said St. Clair. He had to be smart, to pick his battles. By making a deal with Schultz, he was able to maintain control over the numbers racket and protect his community. The uneasy truce that followed allowed Bumpy to solidify his position in Harlem. He continued to expand his network of informants and enforcers, ensuring that no one, not even Schultz, could challenge his authority without facing severe consequences. But the respite was short-lived. In 1935, Schultz, growing increasingly erratic and paranoid, decided to make a power play and eliminate his rivals once and for all. He ordered a hit on Bumpy, setting off a new wave of violence that would test the limits of Harlem's resilience. As the gunfire echoed through the streets, Bumpy found himself in a desperate fight for survival. He knew that if he fell, Harlem would be left at the mercy of Schultz's brutality. Drawing on every ounce of his cunning and resourcefulness, Bumpy orchestrated a daring counterattack, striking at the heart of Schultz's organization. The battle that ensued was a bloody and chaotic affair, with innocent bystanders caught in the crossfire. But in the end, Bumpy emerged victorious, his control over Harlem's underworld cemented. Schultz, wounded and humiliated, was forced to retreat, his dreams of Harlem domination shattered. "Bumpy saved us that day," said Delaney, his voice thick with emotion. "He protected our community, even if it meant getting his hands dirty. That's the kind of man he was. A fighter, a survivor, and a guardian of Harlem." The war with Dutch Schultz had taken a heavy toll on Bumpy, both physically and emotionally. But he had proven himself to be a formidable adversary, a man willing to do whatever it took to protect his turf and his people. As the dust settled, Bumpy's reputation as a powerful and influential figure in Harlem's underworld had only grown stronger. With Schultz vanquished, Bumpy turned his attention to solidifying his alliance with the Italian Mafia, a move that would further cement his control over Harlem's criminal landscape. The next chapter in his story would be one of uneasy partnerships, strategic maneuvering, and a continuing quest to maintain his position as the undisputed king of Harlem. Chapter 5. The Art of the Deal. Negotiating with the Mafia. The war with Dutch Schultz had taken a heavy toll on Bumpy Johnson and his Harlem allies. Though they had emerged victorious, the price had been steep. Lives lost, businesses disrupted, and a lingering sense of unease that permeated the neighborhood. As Bumpy surveyed the aftermath, he recognized that his current strategy of relying on a patchwork of local allegiances would not be enough to secure his long-term control over Harlem's lucrative criminal enterprises. Bumpy knew he needed to forge a new alliance, one that would grant him access to greater resources and protection against future threats. His eyes turned to the rising power of the Italian Mafia, whose influence was steadily expanding across New York City. The most formidable of these crime syndicates was headed by Lucky Luciano, a cunning and ruthless mobster who had consolidated his grip on the city's underworld. Bumpy's first step was to establish contact with Luciano's camp, a delicate proposition given the long-standing tensions between African-American and Italian gangsters. He reached out through a network of intermediaries, carefully feeling out the possibility of a partnership. It was a high-stakes gamble, for aligning with the Mafia would mean surrendering a degree of his autonomy and submitting to their authority. After weeks of tense negotiations, Bumpy secured a meeting with Luciano himself, held in the shadows of a dimly lit warehouse on the Lower East Side. As Bumpy entered the room, he was struck by the sheer presence of the Italian crime boss, whose piercing gaze and imposing stature commanded respect and fear in equal measure. "So you're the famous Bumpy Johnson?" Luciano drawled, his voice low and measured. "I've heard a lot about you and your little war with Schultz. Impressive work, I must say." Bumpy nodded, his eyes never leaving Luciano's. "I appreciate the compliment, Mr. Luciano, but I'm here because I believe we have an opportunity to work together, to our mutual benefit." Luciano leaned back in his chair, a thin smile playing on his lips. "I'm listening." Bumpy laid out his proposal, a partnership that would allow him to maintain control over Harlem's numbers racket while tapping into the resources and protection of the Italian Mafia. In exchange, he would share a portion of his profits and abide by the Mafia's rules and regulations. The negotiations were arduous, with both men testing the other's resolve and searching for any signs of weakness. Bumpy knew that he was walking a fine line, balancing his desire for power and independence with the pragmatic realization that he needed Luciano's backing to truly thrive. Finally, after hours of back and forth, the two men reached an agreement. Bumpy would maintain his position as the de facto ruler of Harlem's criminal underworld, but he would be required to pay a regular tribute to the Mafia and consult with Luciano's representatives on major decisions. In return, the Italians would provide him with muscle, legal counsel, and a degree of insulation from law enforcement scrutiny. As Bumpy shook Luciano's hand, sealing the deal, he felt a mixture of relief and trepidation. He had secured a powerful ally, but at the cost of some of his autonomy. The weight of this new arrangement would shape the course of Bumpy's career in the years to come, testing the limits of his adaptability and strategic acumen. Back in Harlem, Bumpy wasted no time in implementing the changes brought about by his alliance with the Mafia. He expanded his network of informants and enforcers, leveraging the resources provided by Luciano's organization to solidify his grip on the neighborhood's criminal enterprises. The numbers racket, which had been the foundation of his rise to power, flourished under this new arrangement, with Bumpy's profits soaring to unprecedented heights. Yet, the partnership with the Italians was not without its challenges. Bumpy had to navigate the delicate balance of maintaining his reputation as a champion of the Harlem community, while adhering to the Mafia's often ruthless methods. There were moments when he had to suppress his instincts to protect his people, instead following the directives handed down from Luciano's lieutenants. This uneasy compromise weighed heavily on Bumpy, who had long prided himself on his ability to provide for his community. He found himself torn between his desire to be a benevolent Robin Hood figure and the harsh realities of the criminal world in which he now operated. The duality of his persona, the charitable community leader and the ruthless crime boss, became increasingly difficult to reconcile. As Bumpy's power and wealth continued to grow, so too did the scrutiny of law enforcement. The FBI, in particular, had been keeping a close eye on his activities, and the alliance with the Mafia only heightened their interest. Bumpy knew that he was walking a tightrope, one misstep away from a fall that could cost him everything he had worked so hard to build. Nevertheless, Bumpy remained steadfast in his determination to maintain his control over Harlem's underworld. He had come too far to let it all slip through his fingers, and the Mafia's backing had given him a level of security and influence that he had never before experienced. The question that now hung in the air was whether he could continue to balance the demands of his criminal empire with the needs of the community he had sworn to protect. Chapter 6: The Robin Hood of Harlem, a complex legacy. As Bumpy Johnson's criminal empire grew, he began to cultivate a unique reputation within Harlem's close-knit community. While his ruthless tactics and violent rise to power were well known among his underworld peers, Bumpy also developed a curious duality, that of a bloodthirsty gangster and a benefactor to the poor. Harlem in the 1930s and 1940s was a neighborhood plagued by poverty, discrimination, and limited economic opportunities for its predominantly African-American residents. Bumpy recognized early on that maintaining his power and influence required more than just brute force and intimidation. He understood the importance of cultivating goodwill and a sense of loyalty among the people he sought to control. Bumpy knew that you couldn't just be a cold-blooded killer and expect to run things in Harlem, explained Reverend James Cunningham, a longtime Harlem community leader. He had to show the people that he was looking out for them, that he was their protector against the white establishment that was keeping them down. True to his word, Bumpy began to distribute food, clothing, and money to the poorest residents of Harlem. He established a network of informants and trusted lieutenants who would scour the neighborhood, identifying families in need and discreetly delivering aid. This earned him the moniker of the Robin Hood of Harlem, a criminal mastermind who used his ill-gotten gains to support the community he ruled over. Bumpy would show up at our doorstep with bags of groceries, sometimes even cash, recalled Edna Wilkins, a lifelong Harlem resident. He'd say, "I know times are tough, but I want to make sure you and your kids are taken care of." It was a strange thing, seeing this notorious gangster acting like a saint. This duality, Bumpy the ruthless crime boss and Bumpy the community benefactor, was a source of both fascination and consternation among Harlem's residents. Some viewed him as a savior, a protector, who stood up to the white power structure that had long oppressed them. Others, however, were deeply troubled by the source of his wealth and the violent means by which he maintained his control. Bumpy was a complex figure, no doubt about it, said Dr. Evelyn Higgins, a historian specializing in the African-American experience in Harlem. On one hand, he was a brutal criminal who didn't hesitate to use violence to get what he wanted. But on the other hand, he genuinely cared about the people of Harlem and tried to help them in his own way. Bumpy's charitable acts extended beyond individual households. He also invested in local businesses, providing loans and support to struggling entrepreneurs, particularly those owned by African Americans. This, in turn, helped to stimulate Harlem's economy and create much-needed jobs for the community. Bumpy understood that if Harlem was to thrive, he needed to have the support of the people, explained Louis Greco, a former member of the Italian Mafia who had dealings with Bumpy. So he made sure to spread his wealth around to show the community that he was looking out for them not just lining his own pockets. This strategy proved effective, as Bumpy's reputation as a protector and benefactor grew among Harlem's residents. He became a revered figure, someone who could be relied upon to intervene in disputes, provide financial assistance, and even intercede with the police on behalf of the community. "Bumpy was the closest thing we had to a king in Harlem," said Reverend Cunningham. "The people saw him as their champion, someone who was willing to stand up to the white establishment and fight for their interests. That's why he had such a strong following, even among those who knew about his criminal activities." However, Bumpy's philanthropic efforts were not without their critics. Some argued that his charitable acts were merely a calculated ploy to maintain his power and control over the neighborhood. They saw his benevolence as a means of buying loyalty and ensuring the continued flow of illicit revenue from his various criminal enterprises. "Bumpy was no saint, let's be clear about that," said Dr. Higgins. "He used his wealth and influence to keep the people of Harlem in line, to make sure they didn't challenge his authority. His charitable acts were, in many ways, a form of political patronage, a way of securing the community's support and silencing any potential dissent. Despite these criticisms, Bumpy's legacy as the Robin Hood of Harlem endures. His ability to balance his criminal activities with a genuine concern for the well-being of his community has made him a complex and enduring figure in the history of Harlem and the African-American experience. "Bumpy Johnson was a man of contradictions," concluded Reverend Cunningham. "He was a ruthless gangster, but also a protector and benefactor to the people. That's what makes his story so fascinating and so important. He's a reminder that the line between good and evil is often blurred, especially when you're fighting to survive in a system that's stacked against you." As Bumpy's reign in Harlem drew to a close, the complex legacy he left behind would continue to shape the community for generations to come, sparking debates about the nature of power, the limits of morality, and the enduring resilience of the human spirit. Chapter 7. The Long Arm of the Law. Bumpy's Downfall. As Bumpy Johnson's power and influence in Harlem's underworld grew, the eyes of law enforcement began to focus more intently on his criminal activities. The FBI, in particular, had long been monitoring Bumpy's operations, recognizing him as a key figure in the city's organized crime landscape. Agents had been meticulously piecing together evidence, building a case that they hoped would finally bring down the elusive King of Harlem. Bumpy's ability to evade capture and maintain control over his vast criminal empire had frustrated the authorities for years, but they were determined to break his hold on the neighborhood. In the early 1950s, the noose began to tighten around Bumpy. Wiretaps and informants provided the FBI with a trove of incriminating information, detailing Bumpy's involvement in a wide range of illegal enterprises, from the numbers racket to drug trafficking. The Bureau's agents worked tirelessly, coordinating with local police to gather the evidence they needed to make their move. Bumpy, ever the shrewd strategist, sensed the growing threat. He had long cultivated a network of allies and informants within the NYPD, allowing him to stay one step ahead of the law. However, the sheer scale of the federal investigation, coupled with the resources at the FBI's disposal, proved increasingly difficult for Bumpy to navigate. As the pressure mounted, Bumpy found himself forced to make difficult decisions. Should he continue to operate openly, relying on his reputation and community connections to shield him? Or should he retreat into the shadows, scaling back his activities to avoid detection? The stakes were high, and Bumpy knew that a single misstep could bring about his downfall. Ultimately, Bumpy's decision to maintain his presence and influence in Harlem would prove to be his undoing. In 1952, the FBI struck, executing a series of coordinated raids and arrests that targeted Bumpy's vast criminal empire. The centerpiece of the operation was a drug conspiracy case that sought to implicate Bumpy as the mastermind behind a heroin trafficking ring. The trial that followed was a media spectacle, with the government presenting a seemingly airtight case against the infamous Harlem kingpin. Prosecutors painted Bumpy as a ruthless criminal who had exploited the vulnerabilities of his own community, fueling addiction and violence for personal gain. The defense, led by a team of high-profile attorneys, fought back fiercely, portraying Bumpy as a victim of racial prejudice and a champion of the downtrodden. In the end, the weight of the evidence proved too much for Bumpy to overcome. After a tense and dramatic courtroom battle, the jury returned a guilty verdict, convicting Bumpy on multiple counts of drug conspiracy. The sentence was harsh: 15 years in the federal penitentiary, with the first 10 to be served at the notorious Alcatraz prison. As Bumpy was led away in handcuffs, a hush fell over the Harlem community. Many residents who had long seen Bumpy as a protector and benefactor were devastated by the outcome. They recognized that the loss of their Robin Hood figure would leave a significant void in the neighborhood, one that would be difficult to fill. For Bumpy, the journey to Alcatraz marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life, one that would test the limits of his resilience and adaptability. Behind the imposing walls of the island fortress, he would be forced to confront the consequences of his actions and grapple with the uncertain future that lay ahead. The downfall of Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, the self-proclaimed king of Harlem, sent shockwaves through the community and beyond. It was a stark reminder that even the most powerful and entrenched criminal figures were not immune to the long arm of the law. As the dust settled, the question remained: what lasting impact would Bumpy's legacy have on the neighborhoods he once dominated? Chapter 8. Behind Bars: Life in Alcatraz. The steel gates of Alcatraz clanged shut behind Bumpy Johnson as he stepped into the grim confines of America's most notorious prison. The deafening silence that enveloped the island fortress was a stark contrast to the bustling streets of Harlem he had left behind. As he was led to his cell, Bumpy's mind raced with a mixture of trepidation and determination. He had never imagined his criminal empire would land him in this place, but he was resolved to emerge stronger than ever. Bumpy's arrival at Alcatraz in 1952 marked a significant turning point in his life. After years of eluding the law, his conviction on drug conspiracy charges had finally caught up with him. As he settled into his cramped cell, he couldn't help but reflect on the series of events that had led him to this juncture. The first few weeks were a brutal adjustment. Bumpy, accustomed to the relative freedom and comforts of Harlem, found the regimented routine and harsh conditions of Alcatraz to be a jarring experience. The constant clanging of cell doors, the echoing footsteps of guards, and the relentless monotony of prison life threatened to break his spirit. It was like being trapped in a living hell, Bumpy later recounted in an interview. I had to dig deep and find the strength to endure, because I knew I couldn't let them break me. Gradually, Bumpy adapted to the rhythms of Alcatraz, using his keen intellect and resourcefulness to navigate the complex social dynamics of the prison. He observed the other inmates closely, studying their behaviors and alliances, and soon established himself as a respected figure within the inmate hierarchy. One of Bumpy's first moves was to reach out to the prison's more notorious residents, including the likes of Al Capone and James Whitey Bulger. These connections not only provided him with a sense of security, but also allowed him to gather valuable intelligence about the inner workings of the institution. Bumpy had a way of commanding respect, even behind bars, recalled a former Alcatraz inmate. He wasn't the biggest or the toughest, but there was an aura about him that made people think twice before crossing him. As Bumpy settled into his daily routine, he began to explore the various intellectual and recreational pursuits available to inmates. He immersed himself in the prison's well-stocked library, devouring books on history, philosophy, and the law. This thirst for knowledge not only kept his mind sharp, but also provided a much-needed escape from the monotony of prison life. Bumpy was always reading, always thinking, said a former Alcatraz guard. He'd spend hours in the library, and then you'd see him pacing his cell, lost in thought. It was like he was planning his next move, even behind bars. In addition to his intellectual pursuits, Bumpy also used his time in Alcatraz to maintain his connections with the outside world. Through a network of trusted intermediaries, he continued to receive updates on the state of his criminal empire in Harlem and strategize ways to retain his influence over the neighborhood's underworld. Bumpy was never one to just sit back and do his time, remarked a former Harlem associate. He was always working, always plotting. Even from the depths of Alcatraz, he was pulling the strings and making sure his interests were protected. As the years passed, Bumpy's reputation within Alcatraz only grew stronger. His ability to navigate the complex social dynamics of the prison, his unwavering resolve, and his strategic thinking earned him the respect of both inmates and guards alike. In a place where survival often depended on one's ability to adapt and thrive, Bumpy Johnson proved to be a formidable presence. Yet, despite his relative success in Alcatraz, Bumpy never lost sight of his ultimate goal, returning to Harlem and reclaiming his position as the neighborhood's undisputed king. The thought of his beloved community and the legacy he had built there provided him with the motivation to endure the hardships of prison life. Harlem was always on his mind, recalled a former Alcatraz inmate who had befriended Bumpy. He'd talk about the streets, the people, the businesses he had built. It was clear that Harlem was the driving force behind his will to survive and thrive, even in the depths of Alcatraz. As the years passed, Bumpy's determination only grew stronger. He meticulously planned his return, using his connections and influence to ensure that his criminal empire would remain intact in his absence. With each passing day, the thought of walking the streets of Harlem once again fueled his resolve, and he knew that when the time came, he would be ready to reclaim his throne. Chapter 9. The Homecoming King returned to a changed Harlem. Bumpy Johnson stepped out of the prison bus, his eyes squinting against the bright midday sun as he took in the sights and sounds of Harlem. It had been over a decade since he had last walked these streets, and the neighborhood he once ruled with an iron fist had undergone a profound transformation. Gone were the bustling numbers parlors, the speakeasies, and the visible signs of his criminal empire. In their place, Bumpy saw a community in flux. Storefronts displaying Black Pride posters, the rumble of Motown music spilling onto the sidewalks, and young people marching for civil rights. This was not the Harlem he had left behind. As Bumpy made his way through the crowded streets, he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The connections, the informants, the intricate web of power that had once been his domain. All of it seemed to have shifted, leaving him disoriented and unsure of his place. Bumpy's first stop was the old brownstone that had once served as his headquarters. The building still stood, but the familiar faces were gone, replaced by strangers. He stood on the stoop, running his calloused fingers along the peeling paint, memories of past triumphs and setbacks flooding his mind. "Ain't seen you round these parts in a long time, Bumpy," a voice called out from the sidewalk. Bumpy turned to see a young man, his eyes narrowed with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "You come back to reclaim your throne?" Bumpy let out a weary sigh, the weight of his years in prison evident in his posture. "Nah, son," he replied, his deep baritone voice resonating with the young man. "I ain't here to take over nothing, just trying to figure out where I fit in this new Harlem." The young man nodded, a hint of understanding in his expression. "Things ain't like they used to be, you know? The game's changed. Lot of new players, new rules." He paused, eyeing Bumpy thoughtfully. "But maybe you still got a place here, if you play it right." Bumpy considered the young man's words, his mind racing with the implications. He had spent over a decade in the confines of Alcatraz, isolated from the constant evolution of Harlem's underworld. Now, he found himself a stranger in a familiar land, forced to navigate a landscape he no longer recognized. As he made his way through the neighborhood, Bumpy couldn't help but notice the subtle shifts in the community's dynamics. The old power structures had been upended, with new leaders emerging from the civil rights movement and the growing black nationalist sentiment. The numbers racket, once Bumpy's domain, had been supplanted by the rise of legal lotteries and the increasing influence of the Italian Mafia. Bumpy's reputation as the Robin Hood of Harlem had not been forgotten, but it seemed to hold less sway in the eyes of the younger generation. They viewed him as a relic of a bygone era, a man whose methods and values no longer aligned with their vision for the future. One afternoon, as Bumpy sat on a park bench, watching the world pass him by, he was approached by a group of young activists. They eyed him warily, their expressions a mix of curiosity and distrust. "Ain't you that Bumpy Johnson?" one of the young men asked, his voice laced with a hint of skepticism. Bumpy nodded, his weathered face betraying a lifetime of hardship and struggle. "That's right, son. I'm Bumpy Johnson." The young man exchanged glances with his companions, their brows furrowed in contemplation. "We heard stories about you back in the day, how you used to help the people, take care of the community." He paused, his gaze narrowing. "But we also heard about the other stuff you did, the crimes, the violence." Bumpy remained silent, his eyes fixed on the young man, waiting for him to continue. "So, what are you doing here, Bumpy?" the young activist pressed. "You come back to try and reclaim your old empire? Or you here to make amends, to be a part of this new Harlem we're trying to build?" Bumpy let out a heavy sigh, his shoulders sagging with the weight of the question. "I ain't here to take over nothing, son," he replied, his voice tinged with a hint of resignation. "I'm just trying to find my place in this world, figure out where I fit in now." He paused, his gaze drifting to the bustling streets around them. "This Harlem, it ain't the one I left behind, and I ain't sure I know how to be a part of it anymore." The young man considered Bumpy's words, his expression softening with a touch of empathy. "Well, maybe you can start by trying to understand what this new Harlem is all about," he suggested. "Ain't no easy task, but if you really care about this community, you got to be willing to learn and adapt." Bumpy nodded, his mind churning with the implications of the young man's advice. As he watched the activist depart, he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease and uncertainty about his future in this changed Harlem. The streets he once ruled with an iron fist now felt foreign, the power dynamics he had once mastered now eluding his grasp. With a heavy heart, Bumpy rose from the bench and continued his solitary walk through the neighborhood, his eyes scanning the faces of the people who had once revered him as a hero. The road ahead was uncertain, but Bumpy knew that if he was to find his place in this new Harlem, he would have to be willing to let go of the past and embrace the changes that had transformed the community he once called home. Chapter 10. The Final Act. Legacy of a Harlem Legend. The year was 1968, and Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson's reign over Harlem's underworld was coming to an end. After spending nearly a decade and a half behind bars, the once feared crime boss had returned to a neighborhood that had undergone a dramatic transformation. The vibrant, yet gritty streets he had once dominated were now brimming with a new generation of African Americans, emboldened by the civil rights movement and the growing calls for social justice. Bumpy's last years in Harlem were marked by a constant struggle to reclaim his former status and influence. The landscape had shifted, and the old ways of doing business no longer held the same sway. Younger, more aggressive criminal elements had emerged, eager to carve out their own pieces of the pie. Bumpy found himself having to adapt and navigate an increasingly complex web of alliances and rivalries. Gone were the days when he could simply flex his muscles and command respect through sheer force of will. The community that had once revered him as a protector and benefactor was now more wary of the old-school gangster ways. Bumpy's attempts to reassert his authority were met with a mix of skepticism and resentment from both law enforcement and the very people he had once championed. In the twilight of his life, Bumpy grappled with the realization that his legacy was not as straightforward as he had once believed. The duality of his persona, the ruthless criminal kingpin and the Robin Hood-esque community leader, had become the subject of intense debate and scrutiny. As Harlem evolved, so too did the public's perception of Bumpy Johnson. On the morning of July 7, 1968, Bumpy suffered a heart attack while walking the streets of Harlem. He was rushed to Harlem Hospital, where he was pronounced dead at the age of 62. The news of his passing reverberated through the community, sparking a range of emotions and reactions. For some, Bumpy's death marked the end of an era, a bittersweet farewell to a larger-than-life figure who had once held sway over the neighborhood. They remembered him as a protector, a man who used his ill-gotten gains to support those in need, a symbol of African American resilience and power in the face of systemic oppression. Others, however, viewed Bumpy's legacy through a more critical lens. They saw him as a ruthless criminal who had profited from the misery of his own people, a man whose charitable acts were merely a facade to maintain his grip on the community. These voices questioned whether Bumpy's impact had truly been a positive one, or if he had simply perpetuated the cycle of violence and exploitation that had long plagued Harlem. In the days and weeks following his death, the debate over Bumpy's legacy only intensified. Historians, journalists, and community leaders grappled with the complexities of his life, struggling to reconcile the contradictions that defined his persona. Was Bumpy Johnson a hero or a villain? A champion of the people or a self-serving opportunist? The answers, it seemed, were not as straightforward as they had once appeared. As the dust settled, a more nuanced understanding of Bumpy's impact began to emerge. He was, in many ways, a product of his time and the harsh realities that shaped the African American experience in 20th century America. Bumpy's rise to power was inextricably linked to the systemic racism and limited opportunities that had driven so many young black men into the criminal underworld. Yet, even amidst the violence and corruption, Bumpy had found ways to give back to his community, to provide a sense of stability and security in a world that had often failed them. His charitable acts, while not without their own self-serving motivations, had nonetheless made a tangible difference in the lives of countless Harlem residents. In the end, Bumpy Johnson's legacy remained a complex and multifaceted one, defying simple categorization. He was a man who had walked a tightrope between the worlds of crime and community, a figure whose impact continued to reverberate long after his passing. As Harlem continued to evolve, the memory of Bumpy Johnson would loom large, a testament to the duality of human nature and the enduring power of the individual to shape the course of history. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the life of Bumpy Johnson. If you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more fascinating historical narratives. Like this video if you found it informative, and share it with your friends who appreciate complex historical figures. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What aspect of Bumpy Johnson's life intrigued you the most? Your engagement helps us create more content like this. Stay tuned for our next video.